Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, this year we've heard a lot about this concept of the long march through the institutions. In fact, the New Culture Forum earlier this year produced a book called The Long March by Mark Sidwell. But what about the other long marches going on, in particular the Chinese Long March? Now, today I am joined by the Director of Defence and Security at Civitas, Radomir Tylecote. He is the co-author of a new report called The Long March Through the Institutions, Understanding and Responding to China's Influence on International Institutions. Thank you very much for joining us, Radomir.
Thank you, Peter. Glad to be with you.
First of all, we're talking here about international institutions. When it comes to Chinese influence, as a general point, how worried should we be?
I think we should be increasingly concerned about aspects of China's strategy of expansionism and what it wants to achieve. And we can talk, I'm sure, in due course about how exactly this is manifesting itself in international institutions, including in the UN. But what we've seen since Xi Jinping took power is clearly more expansionist policy, a more explicitly authoritarian aims. They have abandoned discussion under the previous heads of the Politburo about gradual convergence with democracy. And in Xi Jinping's speech, we are seeing quite explicit calls for more authoritarian norms of governance in the world. And again, as I'm sure we can discuss, their behavior in the World Health Organization and around the pandemic and encouraging lockdown policies is already showing us some of the practical implications and some of the results for wealth and for our freedoms in the West as a result of China's expansion and propagation of policies through international institutions. So I think we should be rather concerned. This is going to be an increasingly important theme in government through the next decades.
Do you think that we've been hitherto naive or just simply in denial about this sort of change in policy?
To an extent. I mean, I think what we saw in the 90s was the result, in terms of our behavior towards China, was the result of belief in the end of history, that there was an inevitability that liberal norms of government would be adopted and believed by all. And not just the depth of other cultures, but the entrenchment of organizations like the CCP, the Communist Party of China in Beijing, was seriously underestimated. And so this led to judgments that people wanted similar things from trade, and that institutions would converge as people became wealthier, which is actually a very culturally dependent and Eurocentric view. And so misjudgments were made, and misjudgments were made about the freedom with which countries such as China and Russia should be able to invest in our countries and how they would approach international institutions. So yeah, I do think we have been considerably naive, and this year will be remembered, I hope, as the year when that naivety began to be replaced by a harder-headed approach to how we deal with major authoritarian adversaries.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because given what's happened this year, to the layman, it almost appears that people are still actually being quite soft on China. That almost it's sort of getting off quite lightly when you consider what's happened.
There is something in that. I think politics is downstream of culture, and you can see, for example, in opinion polls that Pew polling have done since 2000, British average public opinion, whether China is held positively or negatively, has reversed since 2000. So in 2000, 80% of Britons saw China in a positive light, 20% negative. It's now almost the other way around.
Right.
And so the UK is only just behind Australia, by the way, and actually slightly ahead of the United States in terms of negative views to China. This is because of the political events that we are well aware of, and of course, because of the reality of Chinese mercantilism and its impacts on Western wealth. So politics will naturally take time to respond to that. That said, you may agree with me that I think some of us had hoped for franker responses from Western governments to Chinese behavior in Hong Kong and their behavior in the World Health Organization this year. So we've seen one response from the UK, which is to attempt to become the world's #1 funder of the World Health Organization. China is currently #1. But that's not yet been followed up by very clear strategic demands for reform in organizations like the World Health Organization. So there's definitely improvement. There's improvement in terms of what politicians say and their tone towards aggressive, expansionist, authoritarian adversaries, not just China, but there's a long way to go.
Radomir, you in the book you do talk about a number of different institutions. We're talking about the big international institutions, but let's start with the WHO, the World Health Organization. You mentioned it there. Can you sort of explain in a little more detail quite how Chinese influence has worked there, and indeed how it has changed and increased over the past decade, 2 decades?
Yeah, so it's interesting to look at this through. Briefly, we can talk about the head of the WHO, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus from Ethiopia. We talk about him a good deal in the paper, so it might be useful to discuss the apparent impact of Chinese influence in the WHO through the normalization of a lockdown policy that actually began almost a year ago as a policy that was considered rather strange and unusual, and specifically a policy by Beijing that is now being followed virtually worldwide. So Dr. Tedros became the Director General of the WHO, having been China's desired candidate. He made his first visit after election to Beijing, and this follows a very close and mutually beneficial relationship between China and Tedros when he was the foreign minister of Ethiopia. He's played a crucial role in normalizing China's lockdown policies. So when he met President Xi Jinping in Beijing in January 2000, he began by praising China's so-called transparency for combating the disease. This was around the time that officials in Wuhan had cracked down on doctors and medical professionals for spreading rumors by discussing the disease, and they took legal measures against this group. So what has he normalized here? He's normalized Xi Jinping's philosophy of Fan Kong, or health and security combined policy, that saw Beijing confine 57 million people in Hubei to their homes. When this began, human rights observers expressed concerns about this. Experts told the New York Times, for example, that the shutdown would almost certainly lead to human rights violations. In the US, it would, they thought at the time, be patently unconstitutional. But then by the end of January, after this visit, Tedros is saying he's very impressed and encouraged by Xi Jinping's detailed knowledge of the outbreak, and he is praising China for setting a new standard for outbreak response. Of course, he isn't directly responsible for Western policies, but it's interesting that this is a part of the normalization of actually an extremely authoritarian response to a disease that has a very high recovery rate, which is not to trivialize the medical harm, the biological harm it causes, or the death rate by any stretch. But there is a change in the attitude of the international community here. In its report in February, the WHO also used highly politicized language about China's lockdown. It said, and I quote, "China's uncompromising and rigorous use of non-pharmaceutical measures to contain transmission of COVID-19 provides vital lessons for the global response." And I'm afraid it's hard not to conclude that national responses in democratic countries coalesced around this authoritarian norm. And I'm afraid there will be very big reckonings, political reckonings and economic reckonings as a result.
It is extremely worrying. I might be wrong here, Radomir, but I understood that the WHO's advice about lockdowns has changed anyway, hasn't it now?
Well, it has changed, although it's confusing. Even in the last month, or the last 2 months, they've put out pro and anti lockdown messages. And you're right. I should stress this is the view at the time of the top of the WHO, and many experts about a rank below Tedros have been quite sceptical about lockdowns. That's very fair. So I don't want to caricature this and say that China is utterly influential within the WHO or otherwise, but this was the leading voice of the WHO that we're talking about in Dr. Tedros.
What about as well now going on to the United Nations? I mean, there have been changes here, haven't there? That even in terms of personnel, from looking at your report, the number of positions held by China in UN institutions has greatly increased, hasn't it?
It has. Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that we describe the different fronts to Chinese expansionist strategy in international institutions, and basically we think there are two different fronts. There's the front of influencing and increasingly co-opting existing organizations such as UN bodies, and then of creating rival Chinese-dominated international institutions that propagate competing norms and infrastructure ownership through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm sure we can talk about those in due course. But yeah, in the different UN organizations, there's increasing Chinese financial influence and an increasing number of Chinese officials in leadership roles. So senior CCP officials are now at the helm of 4 of the 15 different specialized UN agencies. And by comparison, the US, France, and the UK have 1 each.
How is that allowed? How is that allowed to happen?
It's allowed to happen because of a lack of strategy.
Yeah.
A lack of focus and a lack of strategy. And the Chinese have targeted UN institutions quite intentionally, and we have taken our eyes off the ball. I think it's quite simple. It's also the approach that we talked about earlier, whereby it hasn't really been appreciated that Chinese influence in these institutions could pose an authoritarian threat to the liberal norms of governance that we have in the West. And I think as that becomes clearer, it will become a more strategic issue for the UK and for others. So in terms of the influence in different organizations, China, I should stress, has a right to put officials up for election. That in itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But the results of some of this influence include a change in the diplomatic norms within these organizations, change in their actual policies, and as we've seen, propagation of political norms internationally. So if you like, we can have a look at the different organizations of the UN that are run by Chinese director generals. They include the UN Human Rights Council. It's not run by a Chinese director general, but they have increasing presence on consultative groups. This will mean that they are going to nominate 2 new members of the working group on arbitrary detention. They're going to be involved in choosing the next UN special rapporteur on the protection of freedom of opinion and expression.
That is truly ironic, isn't it? I mean,
which is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. Organizations such as the UN Department for Social and Economic Affairs have been, in that case, it's been run by Chinese officials for 13 years. The Food and Agriculture Organization is run by a Chinese official. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization is run by a Chinese official. It has a Chinese Director General. And that's a very interesting case because the Director General there, Li Yong, had previously served as a Vice Minister in the Chinese Ministry of Finance, and he continues to advocate for that ministry's policies. So he continues to advocate in this role for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this expansive program of China's infrastructure ownership abroad. And he did the same in the Chinese Ministry of Finance. Strictly speaking, this is against the rules of the UN because UN staff are not allowed to advocate for national policies, but Chinese staff do not always toe that line.
with the Belt and Road Initiative, this has come up a a great deal. In fact, we discussed it here in a different context, Radomir. This was about the very beginnings of the coronavirus in terms of northern Italy and the great sort of Chinese investment or buying of Italian companies, which were then also involved the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you explain exactly how this works, this Belt and Road, and what it means?
Well, Belt and Road means different things. I mean, One Belt, One Road refers to Chinese foreign policy expanding across Eurasia and the Indian Ocean. That essentially is the crux. And a large part of this is institutions that encourage the Chinese ownership of infrastructure in particular, some of which is acquired by means that create debt that leads to ultimate China, from a Chinese stake to ultimate Chinese control of the infrastructure in question. And we've seen that in Sri Lanka with Hambantota port on the south coast of Sri Lanka. That is now essentially under Chinese ownership. And India is very concerned about this because they believe this is part of the Chinese civil military surrounding and encirclement of India. So that, if you like, is the sharp end. Beijing has set up a number of institutions that are linked to BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And the biggest one is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. Australia, Japan, and the United States have refused to become members and refused to fund this organization. Washington and Tokyo have said that it could rival the World Bank.
Right.
By the way, in the AIIB, China has a great deal more control than the United States does in the World Bank. And we go into the mechanics of that. But the United Kingdom is a member of the AIIB, and it is funding the AIIB, which is one of the products of the so-called golden age of our relations with Beijing.
When did that run, Radomir? Sorry, when did that run? That golden era.
I'm describing that's the moniker given to UK-Chinese relations under the Cameron-Osborne period.
Could you carry on? I interrupted you there, but I mean, basically, if you're talking about that particular time, our support for the bank and our membership of the bank originated during that time.
Well, that's when we formally became a member of the AIIB. That's right.
I see. What about? There's another area, isn't there, where essentially we're talking about new associations that set standards, whether it be in the internet or technology. There's been an increase in Chinese influence in this area, has there not?
There has. It's interesting to understand why this is such a strategically important area for China, because I think it's an area that Western countries, the UK included, have neglected. What is a technical standard? So a technical standard is the definition, or it's a process or a specification that's designed to define the technologies behind a product or to improve the quality of a product.
Right.
And so if you define the standards, you can help create path dependencies. It has a big implication for which technologies dominate a future market. So China's strategy here is twofold. First, they pressure multinationals to use Chinese standards in China, but they've also been looking to sinicize international standards. So one of the areas of focus here is that they have promoted standards around the internet and around surveillance technologies and facial recognition that will help create lock-in to create market dominance for Chinese firms in a technological area that has profound civil liberties implications. And then there is commercial follow-up country by country. So in smaller developing countries that don't have their own standards infrastructure, through deals with companies such as ZTE and Huawei, they are encouraged to adopt and sign up to these different Chinese standards in those technological areas. So there are some rather disturbing signs that have emerged in the last couple of years. In one of the international standard setting institutions, European and US submissions for standards have been actually relatively light, but Chinese haven't. And there have been reports, such as in the Financial Times, about how proposals from companies like China Telecom and ZTE for surveillance systems want to see alarms and personnel deployed if conditions set by a user are met. So basically to build in monitoring standards into these technologies. One journalist has described a huge battle going on for the future of the internet at one of the standard setting institutions, in which Chinese firms are trying to, in this journalist's words, create a new authoritarian architecture for the internet itself. So we have again taken our eye off the ball here in terms of our focus on promoting the right technological standards in these areas that have serious implications for civil liberties.
What is the right way for the West to respond, do you think, Radomir? I mean, you do put some proposals forward in this report. In particular, one that rather leapt out at me was a kind of a new economic organisation, including India. Could you tell us about that?
So this is something that has been discussed by members of the UK government. We think it should become more of a we should think it should become an accepted norm. The D10 refers to the G7 plus India, South Korea, and Australia. So it's a democratic tech alliance that, as a first project, if you like, would create alternatives in 5G technologies to those proposed and sold by Huawei. And so it should become more of an accepted method of working for the UK. And it's, if you like, a soft power democratic alliance that is just waiting to be used. So we think that should be a part of UK strategy. The thing is that we should use UK national research capacity, if you like, Foreign Office capacity, to build a more detailed picture, to build, I think, on what we're putting forward in this report, on what are China's activities within these technological institutions and within these international institutions generally, and respond. And we haven't yet seen that strategic planning capacity.
Why is it so sort of long in coming? Why is there this apparent lack of preparedness?
Because of an assumption that China was going to converge.
Right.
And this really is what has led us to this report. Why does this matter now? I think why it matters now is what's called authoritarian resilience of the Chinese system. So contrary to the predictions of Western leadership in the 1990s, economic liberalization fundamentally hasn't worked in terms of political liberalization in China. The CCP has become more, not less, entrenched. There is less separation between the party, the judiciary, and the state. As a result, there is now more expansionism in Chinese foreign policy. And the implications for a liberal political order are very serious. And so are the results for wealth. So growth in human prosperity, I'm afraid, since 2000, since China's integration with the world economy really accelerated, growth in human prosperity is increasingly on hold. And that's partly because of a switch in global FDI towards cheaper-based investments in China instead of innovation-based investments in developed economies. Institutions now need to calling rule and of its propagation of authoritarian political norms such as we are seeing this year. Otherwise, our prosperity and our freedom in the West will suffer because of the mistakes we are making in how we integrate China into the world economy. So there's been, of course, one can call it naivety. We can call it hopefulness, but I think we now need to be more realistic about what Chinese integration means.
I mean, finally, what do you think the differences will be now that while we're recording this, the US election is kind of, at a state of flux. But if we assume that, there's going to be a President Biden, what difference will that make to the scenarios that you've described today?
Well, it remains to be seen. I think Biden's room to maneuver from current policy will not be as great as we might think. I wouldn't assume there will be radical change. That's certainly one way in which Trump has moved the window, as they say, has changed the game in American attitudes. Also, it's no longer a right-left question. There are many left-leaning groups who are increasingly worried about Chinese human rights abuses, about the Chinese environmental record. So it could even be that from the left of the party, as much as the center of the Democrat Party, there is pressure to maintain a reasonably assertive stance against China. Time will tell. Time will tell. We'll see who is in his foreign policy team, and this all, of course, assumes that he does actually become president in February, and that is up for challenge.
Where can people go if they want to read your report in full, Radomir? They can get it online, can't they? So where should they go to read it?
They should go to the Civitas website, where it's scrolling across the front page. Speak, I think.
Did we catch that last bit?
Maps, do that again.
Can we just do that last bit? I'll ask you the question because we lost you there. Where can they go, Radomir, to read the report, to download it, people who want to read the whole thing?
The available on the website of the think tank Civitas, so people should go there.
I see. Great. Okay. Well, look, thank you very, very much for, laying out quite how alarming the situation is. Thank you very much for joining us today, Radomir. Thank you. That's all we have time for this week on So What You're Saying Is. I hope that you join us next time. In the meantime, please do remember to subscribe, won't you? Thank you.